Oh, yes, take two. Um, Good afternoon, AP Euro guys. Today should be September the 2nd, Wednesday. Hopefully, you have not waited around on Google Meet for me today because there are no Google Meets today on Wednesdays. And so we will begin then. Um, Today, we are going to talk about something that one normally does not associate with the Renaissance. We are going to begin our discussion of one of those themes that you often see in AP European history on the exam, and that is slavery. Because slavery in 1450 does not resemble the slavery of Europe in latter centuries. Yes, even though in the 19th century most European countries outlawed slavery, but slavery still existed then, to be honest, still exists now in this country, but that's another subject matter. And so, yes, slavery. Um, Slavery, let's see, pull up Mr. Study Guide. Yes, what many do not know or appreciate is that slavery existed in Renaissance Europe. And where it says now, it says listen and make note of Mr. Horton's slavery lecture. So I am going to go off on one of many tangents about slavery and related subject matters. And I hope you don't mind too many of them. But yes, so slavery. My opinion, and see, now I'm giving you my opinion. Slavery is the worst thing that one human being can do to another human being, with the possible exception of killing that person. And so, yeah. Um, and yet, slavery has existed since the dawn of time. And yeah, it existed during the Renaissance. But once again, when you think about the Renaissance, when you think about the Middle Ages, we normally don't think about um, slavery per se. But yes, it did exist. I mean, if you ever read the Bible, particularly the King James Version or any other version, if you read the Bible in both the Old and New Testaments, it talked about it referred to certain people as being servants. Well, see, that's a nice word for slave. Servants. I mean, come on. You think those people got paid? Abraham had servants, at one point in time or another. And the Bible actually, in one place, gives the command: servants, obey your masters. And some people say, well, that's the Bible reinforcing slavery. Well, I would like to think not, but yeah. In another word, I want to have you understand when we talk about slavery is the word truth. I try not to use the word truth. When I talk, when we're having class in here, or lie. You see, because if you want to find the truth, I recommend you enlist in a philosophy class. See, because truth, as much as people like to kick that term around, truth is actually a subjective term. That one man's truth is not true for someone else. Um, what we in history need to deal with, and what we try to deal with in this class, are facts. You see. And so when you talk about slavery and things like that, truth and facts kind of get tangled up. But anyway, let's talk. Yeah, there were servants in the Bible, they were slaves in the story. You and there have been five. There have been five, and you just wrote five. There have been five major civilizations in the world that have institutionalized slavery. You say, well, Mr. Horton, what does that mean? Institutionalized. That means within their society they had laws regarding slavery, the use of slaves, laws regarding what a slave could do. Slaves were given official, recognition. Those five were ancient Greece, yeah, the seat of democracy and had slaves. Ancient Rome. Remember that in Rome, 1/3 of the population were enslaved. I mean, that's how they built 22,000 miles of roads, for example. You don't think they did it, do you? Built the Pantheon, built the aqueducts, built et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And slavery continued in the Middle Ages, but once again, it was different and continued in the Renaissance. Interestingly enough, and hope you're writing still, interestingly enough, the word slave, S-L-A-V-E, and I may have discussed this before, the word slave comes from the Greek and Roman term used to describe peoples from whom they extracted slave populations. In other words, when the Greeks and Romans wanted slaves, they went to this particular part of Europe. And that particular part of Europe was, wait for it, Eastern Europe. So much so that those peoples we're talking about, the Slavic peoples, whose, once again, I told you that was a name that you need to know, the Slavic peoples, the three largest groups of Slavs, and you're writing them, the Slavic peoples were Russians are the largest, Poles the second largest, Serbs the third largest, Serbs, they live in the Balkan Peninsula. Then you get into your Czechs and your Slovaks and your Slovenes and various and sundry other groups. And oh yeah, I said there were five civilizations. Five civilizations that institutionalized slavery. Greece and Rome was the first. The United States of America. Brazil. Brazil institutionalized slavery. It was legal in Brazil until the year 1900. And oh yeah, one other, Nazi Germany. Yeah, the Nazis had a giant labor shortage, and so they utilized slave, Jewish, and others labor to do things they needed done in factories. And so, yeah, the United States is in good company, huh? But anyway, so slavery has existed for quite some time. So, yes, the Romans had slaves. There were slaves in medieval Europe. But now here we get into the difference. And by the way, once again, the slaves of the Roman Empire and through the Middle Ages and through much of the Renaissance Europe looked like this. Muy blanco. They came from Eastern Europe, primarily. In fact, see, that's the thing. When the Ottoman Empire became strong and their empire became very large and encompassed, the Ottoman Empire at one time encompassed all the Middle East and the Balkan Peninsula. See, I told you need to know the names and the whereabouts of those peninsulas. When the Ottoman Empire owned all that, they blocked the Europeans from Western Europe to going in there and hunting down slaves. And that is one of the reasons why When the age of exploration began, it was the Portuguese who first began buying slaves from Africa. Yeah. Okay, but let's go back to part C now, yeah, shall we? Slaves in medieval Europe were by and large used in domestic capacities and lived in the home. And over time, those slaves came to be considered as quasi family. I mean, they weren't really family, they were kind of, and they weren't. But here's the thing about the slaves of medieval Europe and later the Renaissance was this. These servants slash slaves who lived during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance normally lived in the house with the family. And oftentimes, yeah, they prepared the meals and did the brunt of the work, but they often sat down at the table and ate with the family. They had a warm place to sleep, warmer place to sleep. They had a place to belong. Um, and if their family was wealthy, their life was actually much better than the average peasant and serf. Peasants, particularly, who, lived on their own and paid rents. And so, I mean, they really did. It was much more of a familial thing. Notice that, part D, many slaves even integrated with the family over time because as the young males, and to be honest, the older males in the family would interbreed with the female servants. I mean, I hate to always be, I'll be the one that shows you both the ugly sides of history, but as well as things that are more acceptable. Simple fact of the matter was, these families owned these people, and oftentimes they were young female girls, and you had, these male children of the master's family who, were becoming reaching puberty, and they looked at the servants, and after all, they're servants, and unless they had a very responsible and restraining set of parents to keep them from doing this, it was quite common for the young males of the family to use the female servants as sexual surrogates. And quite common for those female servants to become impregnated and have offspring. And then the offspring, are they a member of the family? Are they not? Not really, but you know what? They are. And so they weren't abandoned. They're semi considered part of the family, which, and I've been kind of mulling over in my mind whether to talk about slavery in America and what has been happening over the past, I don't know, year or so with controversy over Confederate monuments in this country. And, it has become, you've seen, if you watch the news, a lot of people tearing down Confederate monuments, tearing down monument statues of this kind of thing. I am for being factual in history. And I say that things like that we should just tell the truth about. That we should be cautious about destroying monuments. Because think of it, these monuments, and we've already had several destroyed. I'm very uncomfortable with a mob, rushing in and destroying a monument. A monument that, first of all, for me, those monuments are works of art. Somebody spent time, money, and with great skill, they recreated something that was supposed to be aesthetically pleasing. And it points out that at some point in time, the majority of the population of that time felt that this is how we feel. And when you destroy that, you basically erase the fact that, the South or whatever part of the country felt this way. And so it's as if we're trying to say, no, we didn't ever feel that way. And see, that's what's wrong. You are lying because at one point in time, this country was a lot more racist than it is now, and we should tell the truth about it. And also, um, I'm uncomfortable with mobs doing that. Now, for example, uh, about 4 months ago, one of my former students actually works for the governor, very close to the governor, in his office, and he was instrumental in getting the statue of Jefferson Davis removed from the state capitol. If you've ever been to the state capitol in Frankfurt, in the main rotunda, you have Abraham Lincoln, you have Daniel Webster, you have another couple of people, I can't remember who they are, and you had Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederacy, also a Kentucky native. And about 4 months ago, Jefferson Davis statue was removed, and it was removed. It was the governing body made a decision. We don't want this here anymore, and they gently picked it up and they put the statue somewhere else. I don't know, museum, cemetery, maybe the home of Jefferson Davis. It wasn't destroyed. It was just moved. I'm very uncomfortable with mobs doing that because, for one thing, you know, I'm not a fan of Andrew Jackson either. But a few weeks ago, I saw that the statue of Andrew Jackson, which sits right in front of the White House, I mean, it was covered with graffiti. How shameful is that? That a statue covered with graffiti sits in the front of the Capitol. I mean, that's just wrong. That is mob rule. And the other point of the matter is this: those people who are swept away in this movement of tearing down these vestiges of slavery and injustice in this country, here's your question: where are they going to stop? I mean, think of this. George Washington owned 187 slaves. And yeah, he freed them when he died. But now think of this. How did George Washington and or Thomas Jefferson and or the other presidents, out of the first 16 presidents, half of them were slave owners, how did they persuade their slaves to work? Do you think they were nice to them? Do you think they compelled them with moving speeches? Oh, go and break your back and work very hard for me, and I'll make all the profit, and you will live in a house with a dirt floor. And Thomas Jefferson might mention, and oh, yes, Sally Hennings, I'll be visiting you a lot, and we're going to have children together. And you did know that, didn't you? About Thomas Jefferson and one of his slaves, Sally Hennings, fathered several children with her. I don't know about you, but I think that's called rape. And you haven't heard anything about removing his statue. I mean, come on, he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Well, all white men are created equal, is what he said. Well, is what he meant. And now you're getting me all fired up, and I'm sorry about doing that. But I mean, the whole idea of destroying monuments like that to reflect a certain feeling basically denies that somebody at another time felt a certain way. Hear me out. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they went to these Buddhist stone monuments, carved in stone by Buddhists, and they were 800 years old. And the Taliban, because, they felt they had the will of God on their side, they took an RPG, rocket propelled grenade, and destroyed these monuments that were 800 years old, monuments to Buddha. When what's the name of that organization that's in Iraq, and I've forgotten their name. Not Al Qaeda, but the one that followed them, the Islamic State. ISIS, yeah, when they took over Iraq, they went to the National Museum of Iraq, and they were going there to find these Assyrian stone monuments that were in this Iraqi museum. These stone engravings, stone uh, monuments and statues that had been carved 2,000 years ago for the purpose of destroying them because they were to what they thought were false gods. The curator there had hidden them and knew where they were, and he would not tell them. They beheaded him. When the communists took over China, one of the first things they did when they took over, they went to the tomb of Confucius. A big monument to Confucius, the one Confucius, the great Chinese philosopher, and they destroyed it. They defaced it, and so the point I'm making is when you do things like that, where will you stop? Uh, how did I get talking about that? I'm sorry. Let's go on and talk about slavery. Well, anyway, history is not for a moment, guys. It's not for a moment. So many slaves became integrated with the female servants. Most of the slaves, though, were imported from the Muslim countries of the Middle East and North Africa, not sub-Saharan Africa. The Italians received slaves during the early Renaissance from the Eastern Mediterranean, but also from the Black Sea areas, Russians, Dalmatians, Slavic peoples, and other Eastern European nationalities. Most slaves were females, young girls who were considered as less dangerous than males. And also, to be real honest, the slaves of the Renaissance, and you'll be asked about this, were given, to be honest, better treatment than the slaves that we normally think of in the Western Hemisphere. You say, well, what changed, Mr. Horton? What changed is money. What changed was that when the Europeans began tripping over the New World, they found that, yeah, there was gold in our hills as well as silver, lots of silver. And at first they tried to get the Native Americans to dig the gold, to harvest the plants, the potatoes, and do the work in the fields. They tried to get them to do those things. But they started killing them. And I don't mean killing them from just killing them. They died of disease. They were overworked. One of the things we're going to learn about is the encomienda system, whereby the Spanish had a yearly contract with the local native tribes, whereby the local native tribes had to give to the Spanish overseers a certain number of male workers who worked for 1 year, and then the next year the Spanish would get another set, equal number of workers. The problem was, as time went on, there became fewer and fewer of the Native Americans. And also, the Native Americans got the hint that maybe hanging around the Spanish wasn't the best thing in the world. So they went and hightailed it into the hills or the jungles or wherever, so the Spanish couldn't get to them. And the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English still had lots of work that needed to be done. Backbreaking work, cutting down trees, harvesting crops. And the Roman Catholic Church had actually outlawed, or not outlawed, but greatly discouraged the enslavement of Native American populations. However, the Roman Catholic Church was a little more comfortable with using Africans. And so that's when it began. They began snatching up Africans and shipping them by the boatload across the Atlantic. 10 million. 10.5 million Africans, mostly from Western Africa, were snatched and then put on ships. And the Middle Passage, as it was called, about 25% of those people survived the voyage. And yeah, it was horrific to even think about. I may show you a clip from a film that gives you some idea of what happened to these people, but for that's for another time. That's for another time. But here you have to remember that this will change after the Renaissance. The treatment of slaves changes after the Renaissance, to where slaves are no longer household servants, but now you need hundreds and thousands of these people, and they take them into the New World. And we'll study about this more in detail. I mean, for example, all the native populations of Haiti and many of the islands of the Caribbean were totally displaced by African slaves. I mean, if you've ever looked at the current population of those countries, Bermuda and Jamaica, for example, totally of Haiti, totally of African descent. They were displaced. Okay. For the record, Muslims in the Ottoman Empire also regularly enslaved Christians. Um, See that word reconquista? That's going to be on your test. What does it mean? Reconquista looks like the word reconquest, and that would be exactly right. And we'll talk about that later on. But reconquista means the Spanish reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula away from the Muslims. We'll talk about that later on. Trust me. Let's look at Roman numeral 5. Let's change gears, shall we? Get out of slavery. Although, one last word about slavery. I mean, if you're going to tear down those Confederate monuments, I mean, what are you going to do with the monuments of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? Think of this. One more stat, and I'll let you go. But, when the United States was founded as a country, in its first few years, it was really on shaky ground. I mean, right after George Washington becomes president, they had the Whiskey Rebellion had to be put down. And one of the issues that threatened, Thomas Jefferson said it kept him awake like a fire bell in the night, was the issue of slavery. Consider this. Had the Civil War, a war over slavery, occurred not in 1865, but in 1795, had that cropped up then, whose side do you think George Washington would have been on? George Washington, George Washington as president, he had 187 slaves. Yes, he freed them all when he died. Actually, after his wife died, uh, he freed them all, but he was very intent to keep their service. Um, for example, when George Washington became president, the capital was not in its current place, Washington, D.C., it was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The problem was that Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was a free state, did not allow the ownership of slavery inside the state borders for more than 90 days. And so what George Washington would do, since, you can't expect the guy to clean his own laundry, he would take 10 slaves into Philadelphia to wait on him personally. And then when those 90 days were up, another 10 would be rotated in and out. Yeah. Um, yeah, but had the Civil War happened in 1795, I think George Washington might have been the Robert E. Lee, but for what it's worth, and it would have destroyed the country. Okay, Roman numeral 5. Let's talk about another major theme of European history: the Renaissance family unit. The Renaissance family unit was the extended family. That means not only brothers and sisters, mom and dad, but also the family included, and this meant living in the house, included grandparents, uncles, aunts, and grandchildren. The extended family. Now that is not going to last, and you need to keep, kind of keep a score chart of how the family unit evolves. But right now in the Renaissance, the family unit was mom, dad, brothers, sisters, grandparents, grandchildren, uncles, aunts, and cousins. Pardon me. So, rule number one, when discussing women as social creatures right up to this very day, they were and are regarded as second class citizens. And that's another theme that we'll see a lot in AP Euro, the treatment of women. In some societies in Europe, and this will go all the way into the 19th century, women were regarded socially and legally equal to male children. That meant that women were not allowed to go out in public without a male accompaniment. One of the greatest students I ever had here at Robb was a young lady named Ann Postolowski. Some of you may know or may know of them, Postolowski family. Great family, brilliant family. She's now majoring in law at the American University in Washington, D.C. Her father, I think, is a chemist. And after she graduated here from Robb with all kind of honors, she went to spend time with her family. But her father worked in Saudi Arabia. They had a nice compound, in a compound meaning a walled house in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, I think it was. And that's where she went to stay with her father. She learned very quickly on that the role of, she couldn't drive. She could not go outside um, without a male accompaniment, of course. And since in Saudi Arabia the internet is strictly regulated, um, she said that she would sleep late every day and sit there and think, what am I going to do today? She described her stay in Saudi Arabia as a beautiful prison. But yeah. Anyway, um, everyone followed this standard that males were first and women were second class citizens. The Roman Catholic Church, the nobility, Christians, Muslims, it did not matter. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament said, wives, obey your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. I mean, it's a different world. Yeah. And they took that literally. Wives, obey your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. They, women, could not sue, could not bring charges. Women could not even bring charges if her own possessions or her own body had been somehow stolen or damaged by a male. She had to have a male bring charges for her. Because after all, a woman did not own any personal property throughout much of history. Therefore, if that property was stolen, it was actually the property of either her husband or her father. Marriages, by and large, were arranged, particularly in families of wealth, power, and status, but also in the lower classes. I mean, if the lower classes could afford to be married, which is why Romeo and Juliet is an entire farce. There was really no opportunities for teenagers to like hang out and to get together and to date because it was all arranged. What is a dowry? And this is a term that'll come up on your test, dowry. A dowry is an amount of possessions, money, valuables, land, cattle, property that a woman would collect. Now, it really wasn't hers, but it was collected for her and that dowry would be used to attract a husband. How does a marriage affect the size of the dowry? Well, the better, higher class, more prestigious the husband was, took a bigger dowry. Yeah. So the father is the absolute figure, absolute ruling figure in family lives. That situation lasted until either the father died and the oldest male became the father figure, or he legally emancipated his children. Sometimes, if children were a pain, the father might legally emancipate them, kick them out, you know. Anyway, that could be done only through court order. This legal emancipation could occur anywhere from the early teens to the late 20s of adulthood. The girl, woman who marries into that family becomes part of the family and basically leaves her own. Understand that again. When a girl married into a family, she became part of the family she married into and was no longer part of her own family. She went from being the property of her father to the property of her husband. Okay, most, and this is not in the book quite yet, Judeo-Christian Muslim belief structures hold that having many children is a sign of favor from God. From a practical standpoint, many children meant that more work could be done and more wealth could be earned. Okay? Except for the very wealthy, children were expected to work and kick into the family treasury. Yeah, and here's an idea, as it says there in part 2. The idea that children do not work, and I'm talking about today, the idea that children do not work is a relatively new idea, and by relatively new, I think only in the past 100 years, maybe even less than that, 50, 75 years, that children should not work is not only relatively new, even today, it's only found in the most affluent societies. Most Renaissance era married women in Europe spent their lives becoming or recovering from pregnancy. Let me go back to that idea about children not working. I mean, children in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan. After that, it gets into question. Australia, yeah, they by and large aren't expected to work and actively contribute to the family economy. After those countries that I just mentioned, um, children are expected to work. And to be honest, I don't know that that's a terrible thing. In fact, many historical commentators have said that one of the things wrong with Western culture is that there is no place for children. Yeah, no place for children. The amount of time that they're expected to remain children keeps getting longer. Here's an interesting idea. When you're visiting your grandparents someday, do me a favor. Ask your grandparents to let you look at their photo albums. Ask your grandparents to let you see what they looked like when they were your age. I will guarantee you that your grandparents looked physically younger than you do now, that they are not physically as matured. And I'll make you another bet that your grandparents, when they were that age, and you guys are now what, 15, 16? When they were 15, 16, were a lot closer to marriage than you are. And so now wrap your head around this. And so when your grandparents were that age, 15, 16, they had physically not matured as much as you have. And they hadn't because nutrition is better now. Yeah, nutrition is better now. Children physically mature at a younger age. But they get married sooner. And so what that means is that the amount of time that children are expected to remain children and celibate, celibate, no sex, that children are expected to remain celibate has grown longer. Because think about it, when do people get married now? They don't get married at 18, although to be honest, a lot of people I knew got married at 18, but that was a long time ago in a place far, far away. I'll be honest, when I was my graduating class had 41 students graduate. Of those 41 students, 21 were girls. Of those 21 students, by the time we graduated, 7 were married or would get married within the summer. The other 14, the great majority of them got married within 5 years. Of 17, 22. Today, most people who get married in their mid-20s, late 20s. The point of the matter being, again, children are expected to be children longer, even though their bodies are more physically mature. Didn't say their minds were more mature, but yeah, their bodies. Interesting fact. So, most Renaissance era women in Europe spent their lives either becoming or recovering from pregnancy. Yeah, yeah, story of their lives. Why? Why did they do that? Why did they keep impregnating them? Because having lots of children was a sign of God's favor. B, because lots of children meant that there would be help around the farm. C, because lots of children meant that when people like me become older, kids take care of them. And so, yeah, they impregnated the moms as much as they could, spent their lives either becoming or recovering from pregnancy. And remember that to this day, for women, childbirth is still a major cause of death, even in the United States. So, why did poor women not conceive as often? This was an anomaly that people didn't understand. And by the way, when we're talking about slavery, why didn't poor women not conceive as often? Before we answer that, let's look at the next question. What is wet nursing? The two questions are related. Let's go with wet nursing first. Anyone know what it means? Michelangelo was wet nursed. Yeah. Wet nursing is the idea that many of the wealthy women of the medieval age and since then, including the American South, when they got tired, they didn't want to breastfeed their children. So in medieval Europe, they would often hire women who happened to be breastfeeding. They would hire women to breastfeed their children so that they didn't have to, because it's a drag or whatever, and they didn't want to do it and whatever. And so, yeah, Michelangelo, like I said, the great artist Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. He spent the first 5 years of his life, and when I say 5 years, he was nursing those 5 years. Think about that. Teeth. Ow. But yeah, Michelangelo was not given away, but his family hired a woman. The woman, though, lived next to, and her husband he worked in a marble quarry. He was a marble cutter. He worked in a marble quarry. And Michelangelo says that the reason he became a great sculptor was because this guy let Michelangelo play with his tools, and hack on marble. But yeah, 5 years. Yeah. The kid was already talking and biting. But anyway, so Why did poor women, that doesn't answer the question. Why do poor women not conceive as often? Well, one of the safeguards that nature puts on females is that nature makes it very difficult for a woman who is nursing a child to conceive. It's a fact. And so they didn't understand, the women of the time did not understand. Um, but when they handed off their children to some other woman to breastfeed, that they themselves became liable to be pregnant again. Michelangelo's mother actually was a very sickly woman. And of course, her father kept him pregnant. His father kept impregnating his mother. Interesting story, interesting lifestyle. So let's look at E. So from the dawn of time to this, and the Renaissance era was no different, primary cause of death for women was and is childbirth. When a wife died, she was often replaced as quickly as her abilities to manage a house and raise the children were considered absolutely necessary. Meaning that when a wife died, the husband would go out and find somebody else because he wasn't going to take care of those children. And, like uh, the Tina Turner song, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" Answer: not a whole lot. Yeah, they replaced the mom, they replaced the woman. Another myth was this idea of romantic love, which resulted in marriage. Forget it. There was no Renaissance mall for kids to hang out in, no Flintstone type telephones for people to talk on. Romantic love, yeah, it's just Renaissance society was not set up for it. Kids did not hang out together at the mall. And so, yeah, marriages were arranged. Courtships, to be honest, didn't really exist. Note that in Florence in the 15th century, almost 50% of children died before the age of 20. And so, yeah, childhood was a lot different. You wanted to have as many children as you could for one reason, because 50% of those children were going to die before the age of 20. So you had as many as you could. Lots of children were born to guarantee that there would be a male heir that survived and extended the family tree and inherited the family's possessions. Which leads us to our next question, the rule of primogeniture. What is the rule of primogeniture? It is a word that will come up again and again and again, and you need to know it. Primus, take it, you should, if you're ever in doubt, break the word down into its Latin roots. Primus meaning first. Actually, this is Greek. Primus meaning first, genus meaning offspring. The rule of primogeniture is called the rule of the firstborn. It means that the preponderance, big word. Oh, yes, I like big words and I cannot lie. Well, I do. I like big words. Preponderance, that means the great majority. Means the preponderance of a family's inheritance went to the firstborn son. Say again. The preponderance, the great majority of a family's inheritance went to the firstborn son. If you were a second-born son or later, you were sucking wind. You may or may not know this, but when the English began colonizing North America, the great majority of the males were second, third sons. Yeah. Because in England, they weren't getting anything. All right. Roman numeral 6. Now we change gears. Let's see how far we have to go. Roman 6. Yeah, we'll do this. Roman numeral 6. Obviously, it goes without saying, since the dawn of time, human beings have engaged in procreation, sex, which has changed. What has changed, though, are the customs, norms, taboos, and outright violations regarding sexual behavior. Hmm. 'Oh, yeah, people had sex in the Renaissance. The Renaissance had its own set of standards which evolved from prior centuries but also have influenced our own today. Some Renaissance marriages did obey the New Testament edict of husbands and wives love one another. Others simply did not. In fact, in many Renaissance marriages, there was not a whole lot of emotional attachment. And going right up into, the kings who got married. They would choose a wife based on what country she was affiliated with as a way of cementing a political relationship. Henry VIII, prime example. He only got married 6 times, and very few of his marriages were motivated by love. So, in such an environment, then sexual relationships outside the marriage were not uncommon in any way. Yeah. You had a husband that, yeah, you have to do whatever with him, but sexual or relationships outside of the marriage, trust me, that's not a new thing. There were, however, 2 standards. A standard for men, as you know, the double standard. Please tell me you understand the double standard. A standard for men, which looked upon sexual promiscuity as a sign of man's virility.
There's a honker. If you're in the building, please call 71309.
As a sign of man's virility, and one for women who saw women who did the same thing as an evil person deserving to be punished in some way, shape, or form. The miracle is that didn't prevent anybody from doing anything. In some places, wives who committed adultery, as did the wife of Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan, was executed, guilty of criminal offense. Illegitimate births were not uncommon. So, and I know your parents have told you time and time again how evil your generation is, how you're the only one who are, everybody talks about sex. They are such big fat liars, your parents, so don't pay attention to them. Not in this case. It's been happening forever. So yeah, illegitimate births were not uncommon. Female servants were constantly preyed upon by their male masters or the sons of their masters. And like I said, sometimes the offspring of such a union would be accepted into the family. Yeah. Most females were married between the ages of 16 and 18, while most males, needing to acquire some wealth, would wait to legally marry until they were in their late 30s or 40s. Wind that back up again, ladies, and think about it. Teenagers marrying old geezers in their 30s and 40s. Feel free to say, ew. Yeah. Since males waited such a long time to get married, though, prostitution thrived and was generally accepted throughout Europe as a necessary evil. All right. Are there any comments or questions? I wish you could make comments and questions. On Thursday, we're going to start here at Roman numeral 7 and talk about the political history of the Renaissance. But let's see. We still have a long ways to go in this unit. But we'll try to cover it, and I think we will. Let's pretend that we go at a good clip. Let's say right up now that our test will be September the 8th, which is the Tuesday we return. Do I really think it'll happen September the 8th? No. But, we can only hope, right? And so with that, I'm going to say goodbye for today. Remember that tomorrow's Wednesday. There is no Google Meet, but I will hopefully see you Google Meeting on Thursday. So have a good day, and I'm going to shut this down.